our work that has been funded by DOH and DOST in this forum. Okay, we'll see if I can get this to work. Alright, so I'm going to call my talk HIV Global Implications of the Philippine Epidemic. And what I really did was some studies that we've done. I've tried to put it in perspective in which why it's not just important to the Philippines, but also the epidemic in the Philippines is important to the rest of the world, because we're really kind of bucking the trend. While most HIV in the world is going down, the Philippines is going up. And we'll look at the reasons for that, including the molecular epidemiology reasons for that, and also implications for emergence of resistance. So just very quickly, since not everyone here is works in the HIV field, when we talk about HIV, we refer to the virus. It's the causative agent of AIDS. Not everyone who has HIV has AIDS, but everyone who has AIDS has HIV. So AIDS is like end-stage HIV. Typically takes about 8 to 10 years to develop full-blown AIDS from the time that you're infected with HIV, unless you start antiretrovirals, which can arrest the development of AIDS. This is an RNA virus, and on top of that, it's a retrovirus. So what retrovirus means is that it has RNA as its genetic material, but then it's reverse transcribed into DNA and it's incorporated into the host genome. And this is why HIV is very difficult to eradicate, because even if you shut down viral production, once the proviral DNA has been incorporated into your cells, then it's very, very difficult to eliminate that lipid reservoir. The target cell actually affects a lot of cells that have the CR5 receptor. The immune system, and is involved in intracellular and protection from intracellular pathogens as well. So this is what the virus looks like, and the interesting thing about this virus is it has 2 strands of RNA, which may or may not be identical, but actually that's a functioning genome. In other words, it's diploid. And how many viruses do you know are diploid? So HIV is diploid, and it can mate. We say that HIV has babies, and I'll show you what happens to the babies of HIV. For instance, you have one subtype of virus infecting a cell, and then another subtype, and they can recombine. So that's part of the reason why HIV is so genetically diverse. It has reverse transcriptase, which the biologists in the audience will know is a horrible, horrible enzyme in terms of proofreading. And so this gives HIV the highest mutation rate in the animal kingdom, actually in all, it's not an animal, in the whole, among living things. It actually that leads to that is part of the reason why this is so difficult to cure. And then as you can see, there's all these glycoproteins on the surface. By the way, the cell membrane of HIV is derived from the host cell membrane, and so that's why it's very difficult to detect and get rid of it. So when you first get HIV, you get a flu-like symptom. Within about 2 to 4 weeks of infection, you have flu-like illness, then nothing. And then it takes 8 to 10 years to develop full-blown AIDS, where your immune system finally crashes, and you develop AIDS, and you actually die of opportunistic infections because you don't have a functioning immune system. And nearly 37 million people are currently living with HIV worldwide. 34 million have already died of AIDS in the past. About 2.1 million cases were reported in 2015. There's new data that just came out. I think it's down to 1.6 million. So it's less and less cases per year. There were still 1.1 million deaths reported at that time. But the number of new cases has actually gone down since the year 2000, and the number of deaths has decreased by 43% since 2003. And so if we look at the map of where HIV is in the world, you can see that most of it is really from sub-Saharan Africa. And this has to do with the genetic origins of HIV, which I'll expound on later on. There are 1 million cases in the United States, in Brazil, there's 1 million cases in Thailand. But the Philippines, in terms of prevalence, has one of the lowest prevalence of HIV in the world. However, if you look at a different map in terms of the increase of HIV over time, you can see that sub-Saharan Africa is not doing too badly. Green means that the number of cases, the prevalence has gone down by more than 10% in the last 10 years. Gray areas are steady, and the red areas, which includes us, are areas where HIV has been going up. The latest report of UNAIDS actually shows that there are more countries now that are increasing their HIV prevalence. But the Philippines is actually the fastest one in the Asia Pacific. And this is just, we are 1 out of 9 here. Now we're about 1 out of 14 countries in the world where HIV is actually increasing. And the problem really is that before, about 10 years ago, we only had about 1 case every day. This is 10 years ago, and now we have 31 new cases a day. And that's a 3,100-fold increase in the percent increase in the last 10 years. And last year, we reached 10,000 cases for the first time in history, and that was in November. So in contrast, again, the rest of the world is already improving. We've only had not too many cases, 56,275 confirmed cases, which is really just maybe a village in Africa. There are some villages that have about 20 to 30% prevalence in South Africa. But consider that 85% of these cases were newly diagnosed in the last 5 years, and you know that we're really in big trouble here. So this is the view from afar. The world has decreased the number of cases of HIV by 30%. At the same time here, the Philippines has increased by 4,800%. I wish that was the stock market, but it's not. It's HIV. Okay? And WHO says we have the highest infection rate in the Asia Pacific. So why? Why is this happening? That's really a million-dollar question. So, interestingly, for heterosexual sex, circumcision protects against acquisition of HIV by about 60 to 70%. This is because when you circumcise someone, the dendritic cells on the glans penis keratinized, so you have fewer targets for HIV. But there's also increased local transmission, and there's increased transmission among men who have sex with men. There's also new strains, and this is really what the focus of my study has been, where I'm actually trying to show that subtypes of HIV in the Philippines have changed, and this may have contributed to the increase in the number of cases. We've gone from a subtype B, which is more common in the United States and Western Europe, to a more aggressive recombinant form, AE, which is from Thailand. Is there better testing to a certain extent, but you can't really account for all of those increases just by better testing, maybe 10 to 15% of the numbers. And of course, we have very low condom use, which, if used correctly and consistently, can decrease the risk of HIV transmission by up to 85%. So these are people who died of HIV. This is Freddie Mercury, Rock Hudson, Liberace, Arthur Ashe. Since I'm among scientists, I'm sure there are a few Isaac Asimov fans here. Did you know that Isaac Asimov died of AIDS? He was transfused blood after his cardiac surgery, and he died from complications from AIDS. So anybody can get AIDS. But this guy is still alive, right? So he just acquired LeBron James for the Lakers. So he's doing quite well. And the reason for this is because of science. There's been an unprecedented pouring of money in research to look at ways to solve HIV. And because HIV is such a fast mutating organism, one drug didn't work, 2 drugs didn't work. It took a cocktail of a combination of 3 drugs in order to arrest the development of AIDS from HIV. And that's what at that time was termed highly active antiretroviral therapy. Now it's just called ART or ARVs. This is a combination of 3 drugs, one from at least 2 drug classes. So as the number of people on antiretrovirals increased, the number of deaths declined. So this is really dramatic in terms of thinking about HIV was first described and discovered 30 years ago, and in that time span, they were able to develop life-saving treatment. To the point that nowadays, if you start someone on antiretrovirals early on, when their CD4 counts are still normal, you will restore their life expectancy. They will die with HIV, not of HIV. And recently at the AIDS 2018 conference in Amsterdam, earlier this July, they confirmed with yet another prospective high-quality trial that if you put someone on treatment for HIV with ARVs and their viral load is undetectable after 6 months, then the risk of transmitting the virus is zero, meaning U equals U. If you have an undetectable virus as a result of your antiretrovirals, then you are unable to transmit the virus. What does this mean? This means that people with HIV on antiretrovirals can have babies the normal way without infecting their partners or their babies. They can do surgery if you're a doctor without any risk to your patient. You don't have to say to your patient that, hey, I have HIV, because the risk, as long as you're undetectable, is zero. So this is truly life-changing. So this is what happens. This child unfortunately was born with HIV, which was transmitted from her mother, who was not put on treatment. You can actually interrupt transmission of HIV from mother to child by putting the mother on treatment. But this child was given ARVs. This is what she looks like 6 months later. We call it the Lazarus effect. We literally bring someone back to life. And this just doesn't happen in children. I have a lot of adult patients that I'm taking care of. Some of them doctors, some of them scientists, some of them professors, who are doing really well and have gotten their lives back because they took their medication and we got through it, and now they're doing really well. So because we're all scientists, and because in terms of policy, Department of Health needs evidence to support policy. Part of the things that we've been doing at the NIH in UP Manila, we're trying to generate data which supports policy. So we know antiretrovirals work, but it's always good to understand if it's working locally, because we use ARVs differently. For instance, in the United States, where they have 28 ARV agents, when you put people on treatment, we check their viral loads at baseline, at 1 month, at 3 months, at 6 months, at 9 months, and at 12 months. In the Philippines, we have 6 agents, and we check viral loads, if ever, after 1 year. So there's a disconnect in the implementation vis-a-vis how those agents were used in the clinical trials. And so it's important to understand what that effect is early on. So this is a poster we presented in 2015 based on a PCHIV-funded database study, and we looked at whether ARVs actually work in Filipinos and what else affected mortality. And it's interesting because we went through a number of factors, and there were really only 2 that stood out. First is that if you are diagnosed early, your normal CD4 count is 500. If it goes below 200, then you're considered to have full-blown AIDS. If your CD4 count at diagnosis is low, then you are 6 times more likely to die. So you want somebody to be diagnosed early as much as possible, and we know that. The second is that the use of ARVs, whether it's efavirenz-based or nevirapine-based, decreases your risk of dying. So an odds ratio of less than 1, and 95% confidence interval is not cross 1, highly significant. ARVs work in our setting, even though we don't use them the way that they use them in the United States. But so this is great. Now, shifting gears, before I go into the molecular epidemiology data, let's try to understand what the molecular origins of HIV are. So HIV is actually from monkeys. They're from chimpanzees, but not just chimpanzees, also gorillas and sooty mangoes. And if you look at the phylogenetic trees of HIV in humans, there's 2 main types of HIV, HIV-1 and HIV-2. HIV-2 is from sooty mangoes from Western Africa and represents like less than 1% of the total HIV in the world. Now, when we talk about HIV in general, we're talking about HIV-1. And HIV-1 has four main types. HIV-1 is M, which is major, O, which is outlier, and N, which is non-major, non-outlier, and recently an O type. O doesn't stand for it. I'm sorry, a P type. P doesn't stand for anything, it's just a letter after O. That's how scientists label things. But the most important type of HIV is HIV-1 type M. And this was transmitted sometime in the early 1900s. They were actually able to recover a genome, an intact genome, from a blood sample from 1959. And interestingly, looking at more phylogenetic analysis, apparently the gorillas got it from the chimpanzees. But HIV-1, we talk about, which accounts for about 95% of the burden of HIV in the world. So just to make things even more complicated, again, because HIV is such a messy virus and it keeps mutating, among the M, there are actually lots of subtypes. There's A all the way to K. But you see there's no E here, and there's no I. Okay, what happened? Apparently, E and I were recombinants, or recombinant forms, or circulating recombinant forms is what they're called. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the interesting thing about HIV is when somebody gets infected with HIV in their body, because HIV mutates so fast, you don't have a single clone of HIV in your body. They have what's called the process species. As the virus mutates, there's certain percentages of it. Say, about 90% of it will have this particular sequence, another 5% will have a mutation, another 1% will have another mutation. So we have a cloud of viruses, or what we call a quasi-species. Because within a person, you can have as much as a 5% variation in the genetic material between viruses from the time someone is infected to the time if they don't get ARVs, they die of AIDS. If you look at the viruses at the end of life, they're about 5% different from the infecting virus. This is unprecedented because the genetic difference among humans, if you look at humans from the proverbial Adam until now, the genetic difference is less than 0.1%. But this is a virus where it can go from up to a 5% difference in its genome within one person. And between subtypes, that difference is 25 to 35%. That's one third. Well, that's more than the difference if you say a coral and an elephant. This is unprecedented in terms of its genetic diversity. No. I'm not going to talk about URFs. CRFs are important. CRFs are circulating recombinant forms. Again, when you have two subtypes of a virus infect the same cell and they recombine, then you can come up with a new virus which can infect other people and retain its own identity. So this is how it happens. You have a theoretical virus X here and a virus Y, and I told you that they're diploid. So they have, you have one strand of RNA from one virus here, another one here. They get packaged together, and when that virus, which has one strand from X and another strand from Y, infects another cell, those get mixed up and gives rise to a new circulating recombinant form. Sometimes CRFs are not transmitted, and so they're called URFs, unique recombinant forms. We discovered a new CRF in NIH last year, and that we're presenting that at IDU this year. It's called B/F1. But, you know, I don't have time to talk about that, but it's pretty cool. It's going to be the 98th or the 99th CRF discovered in the world, and we've seen it in 4 patients already. The geographic difference of HIV subtypes is quite interesting. So, the United States and Western Europe are generally subtype B. Thailand is subtype AB. The Philippines, at this point, they weren't sure, but we were initially subtype B, and we switched over to CRF-AB, which is also a phenomenon in itself, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Why is it important? Don't try to read this whole thing. My point with this slide is that subtypes can have differences in their development of resistance, in how fast they go from HIV to AIDS. So, for instance, for B, it's 8 to 10 years. We think for AB, it's maybe 3 to 5 years only, and it may be more transmissible. Viral loads are higher. So, it's important to understand how the non-B subtypes are behaving. But as scientists, you would be shocked to hear that even though subtype B, again, which is in the United States and Western Europe, only represents 12% of the total HIV in the world, 95% of our treatment research is based on subtype B. Can you imagine a virus where the subtypes are 25 to 35% different in terms of its genome, and you're saying it's okay to use treatment that works on subtype B, which only represents 12% of the total population of virus? It's absolutely okay to extrapolate all of that data into treatment data to the rest of the world. I say no as a scientist, especially knowing that nearly one-third of the genome between subtypes can be different. And yet, that's where we are. That's what's happening, and that's what WHO is recommending. And from a personal standpoint, I think that's really reckless.
There's no other way.
That's what I said. Okay, so again, some subtypes may progress to AIDS faster, or some may develop resistance faster. And we know this. For instance, subtype C, which is the most common subtype, about 50% of the total number of HIV in the world, and is predominant in Africa, processes one of our main drugs, tenofovir, differently. And so it's more likely to develop a certain mutation called K65R as compared to these subtypes. And yet when you're basing policy, WHO policy, based on the B subtype, you know it's not going to be applicable in Africa. And you know what's happening right now? Increased rates of drug resistance all over, including the Philippines. And I'll show you data that speaks to that as well. So this is a paper that we published last year. It's available in full text if you want to pass out at night. You can download it and read it. But basically, we made the case that the Philippines subtype has really changed. And this is a meta-analysis of different subtype published before compared to the subtypes that we found in our own treatment hub. And this is not very many. It was really just 81. But if you put all the literature together, there were really only 100 genotypes in literature as well. But we're starting to confirm this with our subsequent studies. The bottom line is there's been a major genotype shift, and we think that AE presents with lower CD4 counts than subtype B. And this is important. What did we say? The progression to AIDS may actually be faster for subtype AE. And so this may be driving our current epidemic. And the global implication is that AE is starting to migrate. When I say AE, I mean CRF-AE. The official name of AE is CRF01AE. It was the very first circulating recombinant form described, so that's why it's 01. And then AE, it's a combination of subtype A. And nobody has ever seen a pure subtype E. But we know it exists because it has KIT, it has AE. So it's called. So the thought process is, if this can happen in the Philippines, where we have a subtype B, and then AE comes in and blows up our epidemic, what happens if AE goes into the United States, where it's mostly B, or in Australia, or in Western Europe? And we're already starting to see AE migrate in. Or even worse, what if it all recombines with something else? And we are seeing AE/B recombinants, AE/K recombinants. The diversity is really scary. And for us to say that we have HIV figured out is really irresponsible, because this is really the fastest mutating organism on the planet. So WHO came up with this drug resistance report in 2017. I won't belabor the point. Just to understand resistance for HIV. When you say acquired HIV drug resistance, this is resistance that happens on treatment. HIV mutates during treatment if you don't take your medications all the time. Or you can also transmit those resistance mutations if you pass your virus on to somebody else and you already have those resistance mutations. So the two things to remember are acquired drug resistance is resistance on treatment, and transmitted drug resistance is resistance that you acquire. Basically you get a mutated virus which is already resistant to treatment, and the amount of virus and the amount of resistance in the world, both transmitted and acquired drug resistance, is increasing. And we do genotype testing, we sequence the viruses. I don't think I have time to go into this. The bottom line is we do drug resistance assays in the Philippines. There's only 2 places you do drug resistance assays, at NIH, in our institution, and Research Institute for Tropical Medicine. And so we use the drug resistance testing when people fail treatment. In the United States, you check at 1 month and 3 months. If the viral load is more than 1,000, then we do genotype testing. In the Philippines, until recently, we didn't check it at all. Now we check it at the end of 1 year. Now consider this. If you have somebody who is on a failing regimen and you don't detect that until 1 year later, you've already lost a lot of time. The second thing is that you're exposing the virus to suboptimal medication for a whole year. And so what happens is it starts to accumulate lots and lots of resistance mutations. And then that person passes it on to the next to the next person that they have sex with. So it's a real big problem. And this is really some of the data that we've seen in our studies. So we have a program called Responding to the Philippine HIV Epidemic and HIV Drug Resistance Surveillance Strategy and Development of Molecular Diagnostics for Drug Resistance. This is in 3 parts. The first part was the surveillance of acquired drug resistance. And this was done in cooperation with the Department of Health because they were really interested in seeing whether the treatment that we are giving for free right now to our patients is working and what the failure rates are. And so there are lots of people involved in this. Genome Center IDS is here. I won't go through this. This is how we enroll patients. Basically, from 3 different treatment hubs in the Philippines, including one in Cebu and then PGH and San Lazaro. We took patients who had been on treatment for a year, did their viral loads. If their viral load was more than 1,000, then we did genotyping to look for drug resistance. And this is what we found. So we were able to enroll 546 patients, 530 were valid subjects. You know, when you say invalid subject, you know, sometimes they enroll a 1-year-old and that's not part of it, that's not consentable. So those kinds of things. That's the mean age. Median CD4 count was 301. 460 of those patients were suppressed, meaning the medications are working. About 10% of them actually failed treatment. Now remember, this is a best case scenario because these are people who actually stayed in treatment for a whole year. This does not include people who died or people who just completely disappeared after 1 or 2 months. So these are best case scenarios, people who stayed in clinic and kept taking their medications for a year. Okay, so failure rate is about 10%. And these are just the failure rates from the different treatment hubs. And we look at the drug resistance rates. This actually says that AD is the predominant genotype. And then among those patients who failed treatment, 87% of them had clinically significant resistance mutations. But the worst part that we found was that because we only have 6 drugs in the Philippines and we use 3 drugs at a time, because these patients were exposed to drugs for 1 whole year, even though they had failing regimens, 57% of these patients did not have an appropriate second-line regimen of 3 drugs. And so what's going to happen to them? They're going to die. So these are just the important conclusions. But one of the other things we found was that tenofovir resistance, which is a mainstay of our treatment for HIV and hepatitis B, was 4 times higher than reported in literature. And this is exactly what I'm talking about in terms of applying things that we've learned in the United States during clinical trials. Instead of checking a viral load at 3 months, you check a viral load at 1 year, and you see so much more tenofovir resistance, naturally. Because if they were on a tenofovir regimen, and they failed at 3 months, and you keep them on tenofovir, then it's going to breed even more resistance to tenofovir. That's exactly what happened. Other insights, again, that the WHO recommended regimen using tenofovir, at least based on our tenofovir resistance data, is not optimal for AD. It's optimal for B, but for AD, we're seeing a lot of failures. And so they need to revisit their own recommendations. And I've already talked to WHO about this. I just made that point, basically. Okay, so basically the conclusion is we need to revisit those issues. So how does this compare globally? Again, I already made the point, there aren't very many places that have drug resistance surveillance. You know, a smattering in Africa. In the US, it's routine, so they don't have to do the surveillance. But the bottom line here is that our epidemic looks a little bit more like Guatemala here, but Cameroon has like a 72% success rate only. Ours is 89%. So we're more like Guatemala. This is WHO stuff. So I want to point you out here to K65R, which is a signature tenofovir resistance mutation. In literature, it's only 7%. In our cohort, it's 39%. So here it is. K65R is literature, and this is ours, 39%. Really high. There's other higher things that we have. NNRTI resistance, and we have a lower proportion of patients who have no mutation. So really big differences since we shifted genotypes. And you know, these are things that we presented in international conferences, and we've had robust discussions with some of the leading drug resistance experts and WHO as to why this is. And we think, aside from the fact that this could be a subtype difference, the other possibility, again, is because we're not using the drugs the way they were developed in clinical trials. Naturally, why would you do viral load at 1 month, 3 months, 6 months? It's too expensive for resource limited settings. And this has implications not just here, but also in Africa, where you'd be lucky if you get a viral load in a year. So the part two, after part one, we were thinking like, wait a minute. So 5% of the resistance that we saw, but 50% of the 10% of the resistance that we saw could be explained by people not taking their medications. But the other half we couldn't explain. So what's the best way to explain that? Transmitted drug resistance. So naturally, part two looked at transmitted drug resistance. So we looked at, again, same people, San Lazaro, we didn't include Cebu already because we were doing next generation sequencing, which you need to get the samples much earlier. The bottom line is, with transmitted drug resistance, it's a little harder because if you don't have drug pressure, HIV reverts to wild type. And using our current technology for detecting mutations, which is Sanger-based sequencing, if the virus that has the mutation is below 20% of the quasi-species, you're not going to see it unless there's drug pressure. But if you're doing transmitted drug resistance, these are people who are treatment naive. So you're not going to see it. So for instance, if there is a mutation there and it's below 20% of the quasi-species, there's a minor variant, you're not going to see it because the major allele is going to be over it. So what do you do when you do that? You look for a more sensitive test. Allele-specific RT-PCR is very sensitive, but it's not good for HIV either because it's too sensitive. Because about 1% of HIV has some sort of polymorphism at any one time. It doesn't really have any clinical implications. The bottom line is you want a test that's just right. And so this is where next generation sequencing comes in. So this is Sanger sequencing. If it's a really minor population, it's going to get overwhelmed by the population-based sequencing. But if you do ultra-deep sequencing or next generation sequencing, and it's massive parallel sequencing, you will actually find that mutation. The other cool thing about it is you can quantify them into little populations that have specific mutations. And so we use 5% as a cutoff for clinically significant mutations for NGS. 1% would just be a polymorphism. What do we mean by polymorphism? HIV inside a person with HIV will mutate its genome several times a day. That's how bad it is. So that you might actually detect transient polymorphism. Anyway, the bottom line is we were able to generate data for the first year. We saw about a 6% drug resistance, transmitted drug resistance, which is unprecedented because we've never had this before. 6.3% is what it came out, and these were all 80. And these are just the mutations that we found. And this is for the first part. And so we were able to do that. There's more stuff that's going to come out, hopefully. But this is actually really good data because now we have data. Not very many places have data. And this is just the other thing. Okay, so I have 5 minutes, which means I just have enough time for this. The bottom line here is that transmitted drug resistance worldwide is going up, okay? And we're not an exception. The other thing is that we may have to start thinking about whether we should be doing baseline screening for our patients to look for transmitted drug resistance because we have so few antiretrovirals. And so if we fail the first regimen and they don't detect it for a whole year, they won't have a second-line regimen. And then this is data that just got accepted through ID Week in San Francisco. I just want to point this out. Don't take a picture of this because it's still embargoed. We're presenting it in October. For Sanger-based sequencing, NNRTI transmitted drug resistance is 6.2%, but if you use a 5% cutoff for NGS, the actual number is 13%. That's about 10%, which is the threshold for WHO to check for resistance based. So we fed this data back to WHO, and they're very intrigued by it. And I think we really have to take a look at our transmitted drug resistance. We also saw integrase inhibitor resistance, which is kind of amazing because we don't use integrase inhibitors, so this is probably important. And again, you see this minor variant over here, that's the integrase resistance that's actually not detected by Simon-based sequencing. And this is a new CRF that we detected, 2 patients in PGH, 2 patients in San Lazaro. So this is going to be CRF 98 or 99 once it's confirmed, and we're presenting that in ITV. The last part of this, we just received funding for, and we're really excited about it. And what it is we're trying to develop a rapid point-of-care test to detect HIV drug resistance, specifically for longevity, but at the same time, we're thinking of using a MinION platform for near point-of-care drug resistance and analysis, sequencing at near point-of-care and drug resistance analysis. And we're really excited about this, more to come, because this will be a paradigm shift. This has implications not just locally, but in all the resource-limited settings in the world, because it's so important in the light of increasing drug resistance that we take a look at this. Okay, and I'm just going to show you my TED Talk, which really summarizes everything that I just said to you guys in 4 minutes. I guess some more words. The audio. The Philippines, an idyllic country with some of the clearest water and bluest skies on the planet. It is also the epicenter of one of the fastest growing HIV epidemics in the world. On the surface, it seems as if we are just a late bloomer. However, the reasons for our current epidemic are much more complicated and may foreshadow a global resurgence of HIV. While overall new cases of HIV continue to drop in the world, this trend may be short-lived when the next wave of more aggressive and resistant viruses arrive. HIV has the potential to transform itself into a new and different virus every time it infects a cell. Despite the remarkable progress we've made in reversing the epidemic, the truth is that we are just a few viral mutations away from disaster. To appreciate the profound way in which HIV transforms itself every time it reproduces, let's make a genetic comparison. If we look at the DNA variation among humans of different races from different continents, the actual DNA difference is only 0.1%. If we look at the genetic difference between humans, great apes, and rhesus macaques, that number is 7%. In contrast, the genetic difference between HIV subtypes from different patients may be as much as 35%. Within a person infected with HIV, the genetic difference between an infected mother virus and subsequent daughter viruses has been shown to be as much as 5%. This is the equivalent of a gorilla giving birth to a chimpanzee, then to an orangutan, then to a baboon, then to any randigrade ape within its lifetime. There are nearly 100 subtypes of HIV, with new subtypes being discovered regularly. HIV in the developed world is almost all of one subtype, subtype B. Mostly everything we know and do to treat HIV is based on studies on subtype B, even though it only accounts for 12% of the total number of cases of HIV in the world. But because of the profound genetic difference among different subtypes, some subtypes are more likely to become drug resistant or progress to AIDS faster. We discovered that the explosion of HIV cases in the Philippines is due to a shift from the Western subtype B to a more aggressive Southeast Asian subtype AE. We are seeing younger and sicker patients with high rates of drug resistance. Initial encroachment of this subtype is already occurring in developed countries, including Australia, Canada, and the United States. We may soon see a similar explosion of cases in these countries. And while we think that HIV is done, and that the tide is turned for it, just like with real tides, it can come right back. In the early 1960s, malaria was on the ropes. As the number of cases dropped, people and governments stopped paying attention. The result was a deadly resurgence of drug-resistant malaria. We need to think of HIV not as a single virus that we think we figured out, but as a collection of rapidly evolving and highly unique viruses, each of which can set off the next deadly epidemic. We are incorporating more powerful and new tools to help us detect the next deadly HIV strain. And this needs to go hand in hand with urgent research on the behavior and proper treatment of non-B subtypes. We need to convince our governments and our funding agencies that HIV is not yet done. Over 35 million people have died of HIV. We are on the verge of an AIDS-free generation. We need to pay attention. We need to remain vigilant and follow through. Otherwise, millions more will die. Thank you. So that's the TED Talk, right? And really a 30-minute talk, and I gave you 4 minutes. Maybe I should have just given you 4 minutes. But anyway, from a scientist standpoint, this really has implications for our epidemic and also worldwide because of the shift in subtypes, and not much attention has been paid to this before, but now I hope people are paying attention. And we need to address this. We're thinking of near point-of-care drug resistance testing, and we have a globally relevant epidemic because it's the fastest growing in the Asia Pacific, but now we have a chance to make a globally relevant impact in HIV. So these are the people that I work with, and of course DOS, TBC, HRD, DOH, and Manila provided funding for all these studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Silvania, for a great talk. We are now starting the open forum. But before that, we'd like to call the attention of Dr. Donabel Tubera and Dr. Alice Ferrer to please submit your score sheets at the poster exhibit area. Okay, so we have 15 minutes for the open forum. Aren't you more scared about HIV because of the genetic diversity? So we have a microphone at the front. So anybody, I think this is a very interesting topic, and I know that someone probably has a question in there for Dr. Silvania. Please identify yourself, ma'am, and then good afternoon. I'm Tercy Catacolosa from Palang State University. Perhaps I can say much about the findings because what I do most is social science research. I just want to know if our dear speaker has been informed about the possible rising incidence of HIV in Palawan / Puerto Princesa. I'm just thinking if or is it probable that sex tourism might be contributing to the cause of the rising incidence? Thank you.
So thanks for that question. I'll tackle both questions. First of all, incidence is very difficult to calculate for HIV because it takes about 10 years to go to full-blown AIDS. So really go more with prevalence rather than incidence right now. There are prospective studies looking at incidence, but overall the prevalence of HIV is rising throughout the Philippines. The highest prevalence is among MSMs, men who have sex with men, and nationwide it's about 5.8%. In Palawan, I think it's about 8%. In Cebu, it's 14%. In Manila, it's about 7.8% as well, same as Palawan. So this is across the board. General population prevalence is actually very low because we're talking about 58,000 cases in 100 million people. So what we have is a concentrated epidemic. But what we know from epidemiology is that once you have a hyper-endemic focus, meaning the prevalence in a particular population goes above 5%, then you start to see spillover into the general population. Remember that 40% of our men who have sex with men are bisexual, so they are transmitting to their female partners, and the female partners are not thinking that they actually have risk. So my own advocacy is if you've had sex in the last 10 years, you should get an HIV test, unless you're absolutely sure that your partner didn't sleep with anyone else. That's what I say. In terms of the sex tourism, so it's interesting. In the past, before 2006, we had about half and half imported HIV and local transmission. Nowadays, 90% of the transmission is local. So this is an homegrown epidemic. Certainly, the sex tourism can contribute, but if you look at most patients, they have an AZ subtype, meaning it's not something coming from the US because then you'd see B subtypes. This is a local epidemic and we have to take care of it.
My second question, it seems the interest in research is in discovering something that will arrest the rising incidence of HIV. However, I'm just thinking, do you still believe that the academic institutions can still play a big role in raising the awareness of our students? So, at least, if they be educated well, then perhaps we might probably control the incidents.
Absolutely. I think that everyone should be involved in the response. Academia has particularly high responsibility because we understand the problem, we can educate people, and also you have to think out of the box. In 2009, I produced a rock concert just to raise money for a CD4 count for our clinic. You have to think out of the box. That TED Talk you saw has 1.3 million views right now. So we need to think out of the box, not just from our ivory tower, because we have the knowledge and we have to share it. And the more we share it, the more people know, the more they protect themselves.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ma'am, for your question. Are there any other question? Yes, sir.
First of all, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. I appreciate the discoveries on different types of HIV. Just like Madam a while ago, my concern is on the social science aspect of the transmission. And also currently I'm a research fellow for the Department of Health. So a part of my question is actually asking you the ways forward, because I think you mentioned that you wanted to somehow have a diagnostic test to detect the the viral resistance. So is that what you're proposing in the future, to have supposedly to increase the frequency of viral load testing and stuff? And okay.
So it's a policy shift because now that we're seeing resistance coming out, and we have to think about detecting treatment failure early. But even before that, we have to think about detecting resistance at baseline. And so the project, which just got funded last week by PCHRD Part 3, is to develop point of care or near point of care diagnostics so that we can address that issue. Now, in terms of preventing infections, aside from that education or all these things, there is very good scientific proof that diagnosing people and putting them on treatment is the way to end the epidemic. Because if you diagnose everyone and put them on treatment to the point that they're suppressed and they can't transmit anymore, that's the end of your epidemic. Unfortunately, the estimate is that we've only tested 20% of people who should be tested. And so we're far, far away from that. There are some estimates that it's 68%. I'm not so sure. It depends on what denominator you're using. To tell you the truth, whether you believe that there's 500,000 MSMs in the Philippines or more like 5 million. That's the contention there. But the bottom line is, from an academic standpoint, one of the most effective ways of interrupting HIV is diagnosing people and putting them on treatment. And I think that from a public health perspective, that is probably the most I wouldn't say efficient because the most efficient is still education and cost effective. But in terms of effective, in terms of people are not going to transmit, it's putting them on treatment.
Thank you. I might just have, I'll ask you a few questions after the session. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rodriguez.
I just wanted to inform the community that we have another group doing the social aspects of HIV. This is led by Dr. Nina Simbulan and Professor Lopez Hernandez. So that's maybe at one time we should be having both of you together in one session because the discussions are actually very different but very complementary.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Do you have any other questions? Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Probably I'll ask one more as a moderator. So I'm a GI in practice. So I would like to ask you regarding the co-infection with hepatitis B. Hepatitis B is really a big problem also in the Philippines. So we have about 16% prevalence. I think you made a study on co-infection for Hep B and HIV, and what's the implication of tenofovir resistance? Because our first line for Hep B is tenofovir, and I learned that for HIV, there's already the tenofovir resistance.
So it's really important that if somebody has hepatitis B, you need to test them for HIV first, because if you give them monotherapy with tenofovir for the Hep B, HIV will become resistant to the tenofovir because you're only using one drug. There's no resistance to tenofovir for hepatitis B as far as we know. So what we say kind of tongue-in-cheek is that, if you have Hep B and you have HIV, at least libre na yung Hep B drugs. So, kasi for life, it's going to be given to you. But no, don't get HIV if you have Hep B. It's very bad. The data for hepatitis B is that about 14% of our patients are S antigen positive, and another 3% are core positive. And so it's interesting because then comes into the 16 to 17% population prevalence. We thought it was low initially because it's 14%, you'd expect it to be more. But it was, when we added the core positive, then it made a lot of sense. The other thing about HIV is that even though HIV is resistant to if it becomes resistant to tenofovir, but the patient has hepatitis B, we still keep the tenofovir on and we just add drugs. Because if we withdraw the tenofovir, the Hep B will flare. And this is why we're scared right now. There's a strategy called PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV. So for highly exposed people who are still HIV negative, one of the WHO strategies for decreasing the risk of infection is putting them on tenofovir plus lamivudine to prevent acquisition of HIV. But we hope that before somebody uses PrEP, they check hepatitis B, because if you start it and then stop it, you can flare. So that's one of the things that we worry about.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salvania. So we're closing the open forum. So Dr. Salvania is a very busy man, so he has to leave after this session. So I'd like to present him the Certificate of Appreciation, and it reads, would like to present PNHRS, present the Certificate of Appreciation to Dr. Edsel Maurice Salvania for his invaluable contribution as speaker in the session from Research to Public Health Programs Forum on Sexual and Reproductive Health, HIV, Teenage Pregnancy and Mental Health during the 12th PNHRS Week Conference, given the 8th day of August 2018 at Kaplan Trade and Cultural Center, Baguio City.
Ito yung video dito.
Thank you, Dr. Salvania.
Ito na yung clicker nyo. Dito.
So we're moving forward to our next presentation. So our next presenter is Dr. Nympha B. Eugenia. Dr. Nimpa B. Ohen is a professor of demography at the University of the Philippines Population Institute. Dr. Ohenia completed her education from the University of the Philippines with a Bachelor of Science in Statistics and a Master of Arts in Demography degrees. She obtained her PhD in Sociology and Demography from the Pennsylvania State University. She is a recipient of the 2002 Gawad Chancellor para sa pinakamahusay na mananaliksik or Chancellor's Award for Best Researcher in the Social Sciences and Law Cluster of UP Diliman, and the 2012 National Research Council of the Philippines Achievement Award. Her research portfolio includes studies on migration and urbanization, labor force and mobility, family demography, marriage migration, adolescent reproductive health and sexuality, gender and development, population aging and HIV/AIDS, population projections, and among others. Dr. Ohenes recently completed researches are projections of the health workforce in Level 1 and Level 2 private hospitals in the Philippines, UP Wellness Initiative for Seniors and Elders, or UPWISE, Project 1, Developing Collaborations, Demography, and Situational Assessment. And number 3 is the Transitioning to Adulthood in the Philippines, Formation and Timing of Marriage. So to give us a talk, for our second presentation, let's all welcome Dr. Nimpa Ohen.
Presentation.
Okay.